One man, 100 guests, 1,000 drinks. Drinking with Jason.
All right. After God knows how long I have returned, for God knows how long, I don't know, but I'm back. Jasper Bark has talked me out of retirement. I don't know why he wanted to come back, but we are here. What's going on, man?
I'm in a great state, actually. I've just been out at late night partying over here in the UK with in the tiny little rural town where I live. And I sort of live in Hammer Horror country. We're just up the road from Stonehenge, and there's a giant Avebury stone circle. I live in a little medieval town where most are medieval. In fact, there's even some Anglo-Saxon buildings. And this time last year, I helped mount a revolution where we actually ousted our county council, which was kind of stuck between diehard conservatives and diehard liberals. And they were gridlocked, and so nothing got done in the town for ages and ages and ages. And so we actually fielded a whole bunch of completely independent candidates, and we wiped the slate clean. Not only that, we had a record turnout of voters, and we were like 3 times the national average, because we've had like we have council elections and then national parliamentary elections. We've been through 2. And we in my little town, we actually completely got rid of any party politics whatsoever at all, and put up a totally independent group of people with no ties to any national, international parties whatsoever at all. And tonight was like the year to celebrate the annual of our great kind of push, our mounting of the barricades.
No kidding. So why aren't you schmammered right now?
I was saving myself for this.
Ah, okay.
I was being as temperate as I possibly could.
You could be on here completely shit-faced, and you would still sound way more eloquent than I am. I sound like an Appalachian Mountain idiot with a vocabulary that consists mostly of 4-letter words. Yep, and with your accent, you win alone. I mean, you could use 3-letter words, and you would still sound better than me.
Benefits, yeah. It's one of those things. Having an English accent, it initially sort of like it slightly increases your charm quotient amongst certain circles. And it's
Americans for sure,
far more intelligent than you actually are. And after giant great debacles like Brexit and any number of world embarrassments, it is difficult to argue that you are particularly intelligent if you do come from the UK, with apologies to any of my friends out there who come from the UK and are not too intelligent. But yes, nonetheless, an English accent forgives quite a few sins, I found.
I don't know what it is over here. It's such a bizarre thing. And the opposite end of that spectrum for Americans is anyone with a Southern accent. Everyone assumes they're like mentally handicapped right away. I don't know why. Like you could have an IQ of 160 and everyone thinks you're an idiot if you have a Southern drawl. It's bizarre.
This is true. And it's interesting because I love the Southern drawl. I sort of have a complete fascination with the whole Southern Gothic and Southern culture as a whole anyway, personally. And it's a part of the States I have yet, unfortunately, much to my shame, I haven't been to. Except I've visited a bit of Florida, but mainly I've been up on the East Coast. Mm-hmm. Although we're hoping at some point, my family and I, to actually kind of fix that. We'd like to kind of do a bit of a drive through the Southern States.
Do you come to the States often? Every couple of years?
We've been a few times, but we haven't been for the past 5 years, actually. But there are a lot of my readership is out in the States. The biggest number of readers that I have are out in the States, and you have the best conventions by far.
Is that what you come over for? Conventions?
Conventions and again, work dues and also holidays as well.
Yeah, if you like to go exploring, the States it really is a great place. My wife and I always talk about the fact that we don't take advantage of it enough. Just how varied the landscape is, the culture, everything. I mean, if you've been to the East Coast, you just have no idea what it's like in, say, Georgia or Texas or the Pacific Northwest. People are just so different. It's actually pretty cool, and I take no advantage of it at all.
It is fascinating how your culture is, because I come from over in Europe. We absolutely pride ourselves on our ability to take offense with everybody, and it's so totally fractious. And people from one town will refuse to speak to people from another town. In fact, they'll even have a slightly different dialect from somebody who's like a few miles up the road from them. There are so many dialects and so many reasons for us to be completely unhomogenized. And now we're having this giant, great problem. We're going to leave Europe, and then not only are we going to leave Europe, but parts of the UK actually want to leave other parts of the UK, and we're all falling apart and infighting. And so it's like we're a tiny, tiny, tiny little country that thinks of itself as this giant continent. Conversely, over in the States, you are a huge continent, like a giant continental shelf that thinks of itself as a country, which is an amazing concept. And you have an homogenized, unifying culture that focuses upon national identity within, which is basically culturally and geographically a continent, but still thinks of itself as a nation. Whereas over here, we are supposedly a nation that thinks of itself as a series of tiny little city-states constantly at war with each other.
You said that much more eloquently than I could have, but yeah, you pretty much summed it up. So where have you been in the States? Like New York?
I've been about, New York, went all the way up through upstate New York. I had no idea until we went on a big road trip that way how beautiful it was. Into Canada, which technically I know isn't the States.
That's the 51st.
Yeah. Although I wouldn't argue that with some of my Canadian chums. Certainly not the French speaking. We've been over very briefly to San Diego, and I've been down to Florida, but which is the only part of the South I've actually explored. And there's a huge bit in the middle, obviously Skokie, all the kind of Midwest that I haven't explored. And again, I really, really love to do Georgia, and I really, really love to go and do Louisiana. And certainly drive along, I believe they call it the Redneck Riviera, without wishing to be rude to anybody, through Mississippi, and then all of that kind of little trail there, all along the kind of and down to Florida again.
I haven't done a lot of this. I've been to Florida a couple times, but some of Florida is very rednecky and feels like what you would expect out of Georgia or something, but a lot of it's not. So even that state's kind of interesting. But if you ever want to take a really great trip, if you're big into the outdoors, Colorado is just unbelievably gorgeous.
Wow.
It's just, I love it there.
I have friends in Colorado, actually. And that is, I've never been. That is somewhere I would like to go, I must confess. Well, I say I've never been. It's interesting. I've written 2 road trip novels. And one was a post-apocalyptic one. And called Dawn Over Doomsday. It was my 3rd novel, and that actually involved a road trip. And I must confess, although it was through looking up a post-apocalyptic America, it's one of those things that I'm a writer who does an inordinate amount of research into whatever I do, and I like to steep myself in the culture of wherever I'm writing about, and spend a lot of time online, and also reading as many different books about the thing. And so I certainly, although physically, and I kind of stayed here in the UK, mentally, I did go on a road trip and read everything I could about every state, and kind of tracked every single individual kind of like area of road my characters were traveling down on Google Maps, pulling out. So I had a pretty good idea. So mentally, at least, if not physically, I have traveled.
That's one of the best things now. You can use, say, Google Earth and just be on the road looking at. So one of the great things about Colorado is when you're driving up the mountains, there's a lot of cool ski towns that are kind of down in valleys and just sheer mountainside going up outside the town. So just being able to see that's really neat. And I actually have a VR headset now. I don't know if you ever heard of like the HTC Vive. It's like the Oculus Rift, those kind of things. And there's a Google Earth app in it. So you can be standing on the road, just looking around. You can shrink yourself.
That is so perfect. I don't know if you have that type of fine attention to detail. I need to study something so much I can ignore most of the details. Because I find if you do a really sort of quick read up, like read the Encyclopedia Britannica entry for a particular area, you tend to try and cram every single detail you've learned into your text to prove you're authentic. But if you do the correct amount of research, which is probably far too much research, you learn how to cherry pick the right amount of details to make it sound really authentic. Because the last thing you want is for somebody from that area, even if you've mentioned a tiny little town, there's still the possibility that somebody will pick up your book and go, hang on a minute, he's got that completely wrong.
No, you're 100% right. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I've just finished my sentence.
Oh, and I just cut you off. As a nice guy I am. I like to do some details. I like to do landmarks, maybe city streets if it's somewhat important. But what I usually try and hone in on is the dialect. I feel like if you can get certain phrases, certain ways people contract words, I feel like sometimes that can have a more authentic feeling. Not always, but that's something I try to hone in on. Like if I'm writing about a Pittsburgh accent, which is a very bizarre, weird accent in the States that you only get in these maybe 600,000 people in the city and around it. No one else speaks like that. Even 100 miles away, nobody speaks like that. So I try to use a couple little words or phrases like that, and seems to work pretty well. I get a lot of emails where people are like, "Wow, you must have lived in Pittsburgh or whatever." Like, no,
those are things you love as a writer, and only one or two of your readers will ever notice it. But you're so glad when people do. It's that level of authenticity. Just in the same way that you what you strive for is also when your characters is an emotional authenticity. If you catch the tenor of someone's emotional reaction to a specific given situation, and people reading it think, yeah, that is pretty much, he's got that nailed. That's how you feel under that given circumstance, or that is so how I felt under that situation. Again, very, very key, particularly if, because we write in genre, so we're writing about a lot of invented stuff. If you get all the authentic details, which are grounded more in reality, in an emotional, mental, and a physical reality, then people will go along with you and they'll accept all kinds of bizarre and outre situations.
I could not agree with you more. I've had a lot of conversations with people about this because we write about things that aren't real. I feel like everything else has to be real.
Totally.
And that makes you buy whatever the one or two supernatural things or whatever you're doing. It makes those feel like they could be real if everything else is real. If it's like I don't know, I hate using this as an example because I have before, but have you ever seen the Charlie's Angels movies from the early 2000s? Just how utterly unrealistic they were. And just like, I can't stand that stuff because I can't connect with it. And then if they do something really preposterous, it just seems utterly ridiculous. Whereas if everything else had been grounded, maybe I could have bought the one thing they did. I don't know.
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think that sometimes some of the flaw also I've noticed of late in a lot of superhero things, in that not so much that they push things too far to an outrageous thing, but they kind of pull things back a bit. They try so hard to kind of strike a balance between the everyday life of their characters and then the bizarre things that they're doing, which make them less comic book and more filmic or more television friendly, that they lose something of the real genuine emotional reality of the characters in their lives, because they think they can't go overboard on that because people will lose the kind of the more science fiction elements. But on the other hand, they don't go far enough with the kind of bizarreness. So I feel they miss on both counts. I almost feel, because I've written superheroes myself, that I like to kind of make the character reactions as honest and real as possible, and as down to earth, but the kind of superheroics as ludicrous and as kind of like bizarro as I possibly can. And I think when you bring the two things too close together, you're not quite imaginative enough and you're not quite emotionally authentic enough. You lose on both points. And I also sort of find myself of late with I know we're veering off into superhero shows.
We were just talking about landscapes and travel a little bit ago.
And now we've got superheroes. But bizarrely, I found myself with programs like Daredevil and Green Arrow, who are characters that I love in the comics. I find that when they try and make them semi-real and give them semi-emotional issues, they just come off as complete assholes. Now, Matt Murdock is a total asshole, and actually I've less sympathy with him than possible until he puts on the stupid suit, which he keeps refusing to do. And the same, I think, with Stephen, what's his face, Oliver Queen. Again, comes across after 3 series. I think I really don't like you as a person, which is not how I felt about him as a comic strip character. But anyway, that's a slight deviation. Should I mention the fact, by the way, that I'm going to be drinking French beer?
Oh, what is that?
It's called Saint-Omer. I actually picked
I've never heard of that.
France. No. It's quite light lager, but actually the Europeans do lager really, really well. The British don't do lager very, very well. British lager's not too nice. It's much nicer on the continent. The French and the Germans do it better. Britain tend to do ale better. And also, I will be having a slight tot of Japanese whiskey.
Japanese whiskey. I can't say I've ever had Japanese whiskey.
I would recommend it. Because the Japanese of late, they've been because the kind of the key when you're making whiskey, the secret behind it all is to get a master distiller, somebody who can blend all of those specific oils and flavors and get it to sit in the barrel just right and know when to take it out. And this is such a verified, such a specific craft. There's only like about 20 people in the world who are really any good. And the Japanese got so into their whiskey that about 10 years ago, they started offering ridiculous prices. So whereas previously these master distillers had only kind of been over in Scotland, really, and a little bit of Ireland, and they'd only sort of been paid, twice minimum wage because there were hardly any jobs to do what they did. And they were just lucky to be doing what they were doing because it was a passion. Suddenly they got millions and millions of dollars thrown at them to come over to Japan, where they had nobody who could do their art, nobody who could work their crafts. So they've stolen most of the real master distillers. But it's a consequence, because it's only Japanese whiskey, it's actually half the price. So it's like if you're getting a whiskey generally, which is actually twice as good as the price you're paying for it. So if you're paying $30 for a bottle, you're getting close to a $60 to $100 bottle of whiskey in terms of flavor.
I had no idea about this.
It's something I've only just discovered. I'm really, really big into whiskey. And my friends who are super knowledgeable have been saying the big secret in single malt scotches at the moment is try some of the Japanese stuff, because it's some of the best mid-range stuff on the market.
I had no idea. I am drinking about as mild a whiskey as you can have. I'm drinking a honey whiskey tonight. Good old Wild Turkey American honey.
That looks nice. How is it? A rye?
As far as honey whiskeys go, it's one of my favorites, but it's on the sweeter end of things. It's if you're a whiskey enthusiast, it's probably a no-go. I'm burgeoning into whiskey just in the past year or so. So I've been doing the wussy end first, hitting the honey whiskeys and working my way up.
I do like bourbon. The whole key thing about bourbon, it started about I think 200 years ago down in Kentucky, when somebody thought this whiskey that they were importing over from Scotland, it was nice, but you had to educate your palate to drink it. And you had to drink a lot of it before it stopped tasting flipping horrible, by which point you just didn't care. It was, legend has it was Jim Beam who said, what about if I can get something of this strength that actually tastes nice and is nice to sip, is actually nice to drink? And he invented an entirely new distilling process, which kept more of the sugars, but up the grain alcohol content, and actually made it way, way nicer to drink. So I'm a big fan of bourbons myself, I got to confess.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. You did say something I'm finding very true. You have to teach your palate over time to appreciate some of this stuff. And I feel like at the highest end of that is scotch. I had some scotch the other day for the first time since college. I'm like, Jesus Christ. If I threw this on the wall, it would just strip the paint off it.
And it can, if you just knock it back, it can taste like paint stripper. And it wasn't until I did some really good distillery tours and met some people who had some really nice whiskies and began to educate me, like how to drink it, how to savor it, what to expect, how to kind of get. And suddenly, for being kind of like with something that tastes kind of a little like somebody's melted a cough sweet in a load of paint thinner, which is kind of like your first kind of approach to a lot of whiskies. Suddenly, if you're sort of taught how to drink it, which does look extremely pretentious and very poncy, I must admit, because you sit there kind of like, if you drop it, let it sit, take a tiny sip and let it sit under your tongue for a little bit, and then breathe in very, very gently, and the fumes will coat the inside of your mouth, and then very gently swallow it, and it wakes up all the taste buds on your tongue. And then the next 2 or 3 sips that you take, sip it, don't kind of try and chug it. You'll begin to notice like 4 or 5 different flavors. And even more so, I know people talk highly pretentiously about wine when they're drinking it, and they talk about tasting the Nordic fjords cascading across your flavor buds, and there's little hints of bird song and garbage dump and whatever. And whiskey enthusiasts are even more pretentious than that. But the bizarre thing is you do get like a flavor journey. It starts as one flavor, and then it kind of moves to caramel, and then into a slight hints of coffee, and then you get weird citrus and berry taste, and you're going, wow, flavors are way more complex than you initially think. So I'd recommend that in terms of whiskey drinking.
I've never heard of drinking it that way, of putting it under your tongue a little bit and letting it.
And this is one of the key. It's one of these stupid things, like how when people kind of like they sniff wine and then they kind of and they go make stupid noises and spit it into a barrel or something. It's an equally bizarre thing, but that actually is what, and it was the key thing that changed the flavor of whiskey for me when I just kept a tiny little bit on my tongue and then breathed in the fumes, and it does coat your mouth, and then suddenly you begin to get the flavors of it, and you think, oh, this actually tastes nice for the first time.
Well, maybe I'll have to try that with this. It'll probably taste like sugar. If I had to guess. It is good sugar, though.
Talk as well. The fascinating thing about what you drink with whiskey, because most Scottish people will always take it with a tiny little bit of water, and they argue that actually relaxes all the different kind of oils and other elements of it, and it increases the flavor. And you just want the tiniest little dash of water, but people in Ireland never do that. And interestingly, whether or not you actually drink it with ice, and I think that bourbon is ideally drunk with ice. Partly because it changes the flavor over the course of your drink. As the ice melts, it changes the flavor of what you drink and also the temperature, which then changes the way it sits on your tongue. So ideally, you should drink bourbon with ice, Scotch whiskey with a tiny little bit of water. I don't know about Japanese whiskey, probably at work, but Irish whiskey, best drunk neat.
Really? I'm getting a complete education here.
And we haven't mentioned books once, actually, have we? Well, we did.
All right.
A little bit writing about landscapes.
Here's your transition. Do you write while drinking sometimes?
Not as much, I must admit. Actually, it's interesting. I know a lot of writers who feel that it relaxes them and it frees them up. And I have to confess, over the years, I'm not a stranger to recreational substances of most kinds. Over the years, I've tried writing on a variety of narcotics. And I have to say, probably, I think definitely when I was younger, and I would take too much work, and I would race the deadlines. Certain stimulants would be quite good if you sort of had to stop up for 48 hours because you were skirting the edge of one deadline and you had another deadline coming in. And that was back when I was doing a lot of work for hire work, and you had to just grind out an awful lot of it to make your kind of rent for that particular month. But then that was useful, but often and sometimes smoking a bit of weed does kind of, if you're of that, because weed affects different people in different ways, and it can make you very contemplative and open your mind a little bit, I find. But invariably, I find myself actually trying to counteract the effect of the drug and stay awake and stay focused on what I'm doing. I find so. I think, and again, because I write very imaginatively, I'm often asked, what kind of drugs you want when you wrote this, and usually it's just my imagination. So, whereas every now and again they can be a sort of a tool, I think they if you use them too much, alcohol or any type of narcotic substance, even probably caffeine, if you rely upon them, that's when the danger comes. I remember many years ago, I was about my eldest daughter's age. I was about 16, 17 years old, and I'd been out taking magic mushrooms, which grow quite a lot in fields here in the UK.
Eat a couple of those to get some brown stains occasionally on your teeth.
And I've been out magic mushrooms. I was kind of just coming down, and there's a stage when you come off psilocybin where you're kind of your brain turns totally to mush. And I was trying to hide the fact that I was kind of completely zombified and probably hadn't slept the night before my parents. And I sat down in front of the television. They were playing that wonderful old Hammer horror movie, She, with Ursula Andress. which is from the H. Rider Haggard number, She Who Must Be Obeyed. And the central conceit of it is Alan Quatermain turns up in this hidden kingdom inside a volcano that's ruled by an immortal woman who's ruled over this tribe of people who haven't changed since the Roman era, because she's immortal. And she got to be immortal because every 1,000 years a comet lands in a particular part of their land, and the flame from the comet is magical, and it granted her immortality. And she lost her last lover, who was a Roman centurion, who's the absolute spitting image of Alan Quatermain. So she thinks Alan Quatermain is sent to her at exactly the right time that the comet's coming down. It's a sign. So she will step back into the flame with him, and he will be immortal. And Ursula Andress drags Alan Quatermain into the flame. And as she steps into the flame, she begins to age rapidly, and then eventually kind of crumbles and becomes a skeleton. Obviously, and I remember sitting there watching this, and then something kind of like a few synapses began to kind of like reactivate in my brain. And my kind of little teenage drug-addled mind went, this is a metaphor. This is a perfect metaphor for the state I'm in. And it's kind of bizarre because I come from, my family are gypsies, and they're hard-living people. In this particular instance, I thought to myself, that's the perfect metaphor for drugs. However much drugs, any kind of drugs, from alcohol and even caffeine, give you in the first instance, the minute you go back to them and say, I would like that again, please, they will not only take away everything they've given you, they will take away just as much from what you already had originally. So if you depend creatively on drugs, initially speaking, they might give you a creative boost. They might, from the simple fact that they alter your consciousness, they may give you an altered view of reality, and therefore make it easier for you to have a different perspective on life and maybe a more creative perspective. The minute you depend upon them, whether it's drinking or doing a line or taking a hit from a bong, in order to be creative, they will not only take away all the creativity that you think they might have given you, they'll take away from your original reserves. And it's even down to simply drinking coffee to stay awake. There's a point at which, if you're drinking coffee and trying to surf the edge of a deadline, where coffee stops becoming a stimulant, actually becomes a soporific. And you take one more cup of coffee and you're kind of half awake, and you drink down the coffee thinking, hit this espresso and I'll stay awake for another few hours, and you can cave over and fall asleep. So anyway, that's a very long-winded answer to your question. Do I drink when I write? A little bit, but no more than a couple of units. Anything more than that, and I think, as I say, I come from a family of hard-living, hard-fighting gypsies, and there's a lot of alcoholism and other substance abuse in my family. So I've always been aware of the fact that maybe I've got that addictive gene, and I need to kind of channel it into more positive avenues.
I think I'll just rename this from Drinking with Jason to an Education with Jasper. That was a 5-minute story arc.
As long as it's got psychotherapy.
I will sum it up with, I write like dog shit when I'm drinking. It's awful. And the problem is that I think it's fantastic at the time. And then a day later, 2 days later, whatever it is, when I read it, I'm like, this is the worst drivel ever put down. And I just delete all of it. So I don't do it at all anymore. It just doesn't help me. I don't know why. I guess that, because it's funny with certain things, like I like to have a drink when I watch a movie, helps you calm down, makes you maybe helps you focus a little bit more, whatever it is. Even if I play video games for whatever reason, if I have 1 or 2 drinks, it feels like I'm able to focus. I don't know, whatever the hell it is. Well, on my writing, it's just god awful. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it makes me pretentious or dumb or whatever the hell it is, but it doesn't work for me. So I always like to ask that because I'm curious. Because so many authors are so dependent, like you were saying, on these kinds of things. And typically when they go off them, it's interesting to see if their work suffers. It's like probably the best example of getting off things and continuing to write well is probably Stephen King. He managed to transition really, really well. And I don't know that always happens. If you see someone like Metallica, who was called Alcoholica, they got off the booze and no one's been into their last, 15 years of work, which is a shame, but
The very
happens.
last album was something of a return to form, I thought. But I kind of agree. They went well for both. But then King also, interestingly, right about the time of Tommyknockers, his work does go through. It does take a hit in quality.
Tommyknockers, I think, was the one when he decided to get sober, right? I think that's the book he doesn't like and doesn't remember a lot of.
And I think that was the peak of his alcohol use, because it was a few years later that his wife did the big intercession that he writes about in On Writing.
You just have to read Tommyknockers to be like, this guy was out of his gourd on something.
And it's fascinating as well. And you can see because like it or not, even though we write in genre and even though we think we're writing about completely different areas, we're all writing slightly autobiographically. And in fact, genre is even more autobiographical probably than people who write, like Jack Kerouac and write confessional or thinly disguised confessional work, Richard Brautigan and other people. That you can see, starting with The Shining onwards, there's so many different metaphors for alcoholism, and everything from, obviously The Shining seriously deals with, and it's fascinating. I read that as a teenager, and going back to read it as an adult, you go, oh my God, it was there as a theme that I only vaguely saw because I had no real concept of what it was. You come back to, you go, but even things like Misery could be seen. Although King is projecting all his fears and the difficulties he's having with being such a large public figure, onto Annie Wilkes, she's also probably his substance abuse problem, and the clever way that she doesn't let go of his grip and his wrestling to get out, from under her. A lot of his kind of work, I think, is a metaphor in many, many ways, and he's even gone back himself and said Tommyknockers was probably one of those novels where, and his work does take a dip, where his kind of alcoholism kind of goes out of control, and then he comes off it, and then he reaches that amazing, I think from Doom McKee onwards for me, he reaches another renaissance, and his work has been brilliant.
Yeah, I agree. What was the one from a Buick 8? I felt like he was really, I don't know, I'm reading that thinking, man, is this Christine again? And then I feel like, was that his last book? I think he had a contract that ran out. And from then on, he wasn't signing like multi-book deals or something anymore because he didn't want the pressure. And I kind of felt like, sort of what you were saying, he started blossoming again, and he's putting out great stuff.
Fabulous work. And it's also, it's interesting because now we're reading him after we have some idea what he's doing. I probably, like you, started reading him as a pre-teen, and I was just totally in love with the stories, but also massively in love with his style. And I still think he's one of the greatest stylists of the late 20th, early 21st century.
I do too. And that's what he's so maligned for often. And I just don't understand it.
He's brilliant at it. I mean, he's up there with the very, very best, because it's so hard to do what he does that well. But also now I've written a few novels myself. Now I know what it takes. Now I know what you go through. You read one of his works and it's like a masterclass. You're standing there sometimes in awe of what he's doing, and you think, I'm going to go and buy a hat just so I can take it off to you, Mr. King. This is,
every single author I've talked to, just doing this or whatever else, it doesn't matter if it's a romance author, erotic, Stephen King comes up in every single one of these. Every single one, it doesn't matter. And they've almost all told me at some point, a reader said, your stuff is just like Stephen King. And they're always like, no, no, it's not. But thank you. Because that's just what everyone thinks of when you think of an author. The first name that usually comes to people's minds is him, because he's a master. And I'm glad people are finally starting to recognize it, but it's been a long time coming.
It has, hasn't it? And it's one of those things whereby we all suspected it. If you were reading him back in the 80s, you were being told by your teachers and by the guardians of what was considered a great culture that this was pap. And if an adult saw you reading it as a teenager, you would get a lecture, even if that adult themselves never read books ever. They would still give you a lecture on why this was trash, and you're rotting your mind by reading this kind of like garbage. And in spite of all that constant propaganda that we were given, you still suspected that, no, I really think this guy's really very, very good. And I became a hipster and got massively into the beat. I was a hipster before hipsters were the hipsters they are now, because I'm too old to be one of those hipsters.
I just love hipsters now. They're the best.
But I got into the beats in my kind of late teens, and sex and drugs and rock and roll, and kind of pulled away to a great degree from genre fiction. And I read very, very widely. And I became as snobbish about my reading as I had been about my music. And I was one of those irritating people who, if you were into it, I wasn't, because I was.
If it's popular, it sucks.
Yeah, blah, blah, blah. And I don't pretend I was anything other than an idiot in that phase. Now I've read and still continue to write widely in and outside of the field. People like King are one of those people I have now an increased respect. I have a lot of cultural signposts and signifiers to measure him against. I have nothing but a growing respect for him, really.
I couldn't agree more, just because I remember, if you've taken any kind of a college course or anything on literature or English or reading or whatever the hell you guys call it over there, you're right. He's so maligned. And I remember thinking, I don't remember what the class was, and my professor was going on and on about how The Stand, which a lot of people consider as his best work, how it just wasn't any good. And they were like breaking down his sentence structure and the words he uses. His vocabulary is not flowery enough. And that's kind of my argument for why he's so great.
Yeah.
I'm sure he could write incredibly dense prose if he wanted to, but he keeps it so, I don't know if conversational is the right word, or light, because it's certainly not. But by making it that you don't have to stop to try to figure out what the hell the word is he's using, I feel like it makes his writing flow for me much better. And I get wrapped in the story. It's just something with the way he writes. I can completely get enveloped in it, which...
It's immersive.
Yes.
It doesn't get in the way of the story. Yet at the same time, it has a particular character. And it often has an authorial tone to it. But at the same time, it also reflects whichever character's point of view he's putting across as well. And that is so difficult to do. I've personally mastered either having an authorial tone, which is not something I do in my own work, or immersing myself in the voice of the character, even when I'm writing as a third person, which was something that Ken Kesey really, with One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he was one of the first 20th century authors to kind of really champion that. And I think King probably owes Kesey something of a stylistic debt in that respect. And Garrison Keillor is another author. I think King has got that down home folksy kind of conversational style to his thing, with the Lake Wobegon days and all those wonderful novels. But King's is the same thing. And also what I find too an awful lot about academics writing about what great literature is or isn't, is yes, often having a very large varied vocabulary. And it's fascinating that on the other hand, these same people will attack people like Lovecraft for writing incredibly archaically and using ridiculous over-the-top words, but will criticize certain other more popular authors for not having that. Is that I find in my first draft, which no one will ever see ever, and which I go through with kind of cringing and shame, is that often I've written over flowerily. I've used ridiculous adverbs, which are utterly unnecessary. I've used far too complex sentence structures, and I've used kind of vocabulary that has 3 or 4 consonants to every word. And then as I go through it, I try and find the simplest and most elegant way and the most eloquent way to achieve what I'm saying. I'm cutting off all that dead word, and I find it's much easier to write with a much larger flowery vocabulary than it is to write really simple prose with no knots, prose with nothing, no speed bumps that will force you out of the story, prose which just flows and lets you drop into the story and forget you're reading. And that's really, really hard to do. And that takes far more work than writing over expressively, I've found.
No, I 100% agree. I have to go through the same way, and I have to chop. I've gotten much better at cutting out adverbs. But I really have tried to focus on simplifying my writing. And I've looked at people like King. I even hate to say it, but even someone like James Patterson, just because I want to see what the hell is it about this guy's writing that people are just devouring at insane rates. And most of these guys write, I don't want to say simply, because it's not simple, but it's easier for the reader to fall into. And sometimes it's shortening sentences. Like one of my big things at first was I'm describing the shit out of everything, adverbs all over the place, and I've got sentences as long as paragraphs. And I've just found that's completely counter to what I like to read. So I really have to cut it up and work on that. And I've gotten better over the years.
Patterson is really good. The irritating thing about James Patterson is finding books he's actually written all the way through.
Yep. I haven't read anything since he started doing this co-authoring thing.
He was doing that for a long time, I think, actually, because I remember on several occasions I've picked up books of his on holiday, often lying around in kind of like, airports or kind of train stations, making connections. All sounds good. And often the idea sounds quite good. And the first opening chapters, I think, this is really good. This guy knows how to write. And suddenly, like, you get into the third chapter and it's like it's written by like a sophomore kind of creative writing student, because how is it gone from it wasn't until obviously you learn the fact that he's been writing with a variety of ghost authors that you realize, so the opening chapters are written by somebody who actually knows what they're doing, and as you say, you can't fault him. He is really good at pace, and I think what a lot of popular authors who are really good at it do, I couldn't say this about Dan Brown, I must confess, nor E.L. James, I don't think they're very great, or even Virginia Andrews. But you can say it about King, and you can say it about Patterson. Elmore Leonard does it really, really well as well. The pacing of the paragraphs in terms of their length, their size, pacing of sentences, and how it reflects mood and action and activity, and also the rhythm of the language. There's a rhythm. You can beat out most of their sentences almost kind of metrically, and because there's a rhythm. It's almost like sitting inside a railway carriage that rocks you to sleep. It makes you kind of fall asleep and then just appreciate the story, which is another thing, unfortunately, they don't often tell you about studying literature. It's one of those kind of like, it's almost like if you're the difference between looking at something in terms of whether it's literature or looking at something in terms of its craft.
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
Let's look under the bonnet. How does this thing actually run? I don't care what the chassis looks like. I want to know how fast it goes and how smooth it runs. And that's kind of, I think that's like an authorial thing as opposed to like an academic view of writing.
You mentioned something that I really focus on too, particularly when I'm writing action sequences, is the length of my paragraphs, the length of my sentences. As things get more and more tense and action ramps up, I try to do shorter paragraphs, shorter sentences. Sometimes I'll do 4 or 5 one-sentence paragraphs in a row, just because not only that it allows the action to move faster in someone's mind, but for the aesthetic it does on the page. I feel like when you're not in a giant block paragraph, your mind will help you just plow through this action. So if I'm writing something like a fast-paced fist fight scene, I don't want you marred in a giant paragraph that's the entire page. And, not that I'm any kind of master, but I do think that's something people don't necessarily focus on a lot of times, at least a lot of the books I read sometimes. And these guys who really break into another level, I really feel like they focus on that. Like Blake Crouch is a master of it. I don't know if you've read Blake Crouch.
Yes, and I would completely agree.
His action sequences are just the tits. I love them to death, and he is great at just expanding his shrinking his paragraphs and expanding them across the page in single lines, and it just flies, and I love it.
Yeah, longer sentences, larger clauses, bigger paragraphs when you've slowed everything down and you've got a contemplative Zen-like moment. And it's almost, in filmic terms, that's when you have the giant, great panoramic shots, and you have small characters in very, very large settings, and things are really, really slow and extremely majestic, and you've almost undercranked the camera. But then get to an action sequence, most editors and most directors will have really quick, very thousands of little takes in one little shot over a single individual minute. Cut, really close, very, very in-depth kind of things. And that heightens our appreciation of the action. And as you say, you are down to 3 or 4 word sentences and 1 to 2 word paragraphs because the speed has ramped up. And as you say, also, we all do it. There's a physicality of looking at a book. And if you open a book and you go, how long is this paragraph? And the paragraph goes over 3 pages. You go, oh.
What is that? I love to read books, but when I'm reading and I see the whole page as a paragraph, I'm like, I'm going to sleep. Yeah, I'm not going to read that.
Yeah,
but if there's 10 pages of shorter paragraphs, I'll read all 10 pages.
Yep.
I don't know what that is.
If those 10 pages are 3 chapters, because it's a sense of achievement. Yay! Look, I've got through 3 chapters. This is good.
Right. Yeah, it's a weird thing.
Actually something that Dan Brown excels at, actually. And Sean Hudson, who again, who is a very pulpy writer, did this things like Slugs. I don't know if you've ever read that. And
No.
Victims, and he's a pulpy British author. He's kind of like a sub James Herbert, and he was huge during the 80s horror boom. And he sort of writes the quintessential 80s trash. And it's sort of sub Layman, sub Herbert. And he's got loads of fans. Because when you want a real brainless, like popcorn novel, it's perfect. You really have to turn your brain completely off and turn all of your critical faculties completely off. But it'll tell a rattling story. And one of the things he does really, really well is he'll have like 4-paragraph chapters. And each one ends on a cliffhanger. And it's almost like writing like a daily comic strip, with 4 panels, which is not an easy thing to do, having written a lot of different comics. Telling a story repeated in 4 panels is really, really hard. It's almost like writing kind of haikus or telling an old novel as a haiku. And the fact that he's able to write an entire novel, 300-page novel, often in like 4 to 5 paragraph chapters, is quite a feat. It's not a great story. It's not great characterization, but you have to admire that craftsmanship.
So how do you write in particular? Just as we're describing this, I know some of the book descriptions you gave the last time we talked were incredibly complex, particularly for horror novels, but you don't like to write in a flowery way, or interesting.
I like as much as possible to get out of the way of my reader. So there's no sense that I'm necessarily telling a story. And unless there's something very, very specific about the individual, and again, I will respond to the creative needs of whatever story I'm telling. And it's one of those things, we were talking about learning how to write a novel. And I think it was Neil Gaiman who said, you never really learn how to write a novel. You just learn how to write the particular novel you're writing at the moment, which is incredibly true, because you learn with every novel that you write. And Alfred Bester, who wrote a fantastic science fiction author, massively influential upon the cyberpunks, who wrote The Demolished Man and The Stars My Destination. He had a little quote, which was, "The book is the boss." It's not until you've written a few books that you realize that actually sometimes you have to kind of relax into them. And some books need a lot of plotting in advance, and other books really just need to be pantsed all the way through. And you might sit down and think, oh, I'll work out the plot here. And the book just says, stop, write me. But I want it. No, just that's a waste of time. You've got the idea, you've got the characters, you've got the setting. Just write me. And some books, so I find I relax into the specific needs of whatever story I'm telling. I try and answer the particular creative challenges that it demands of me. And I try and learn how to write, how it wants me to write, and how to arrange all the information so it's put in exactly the right way. So have the most specific emotional impact on the reader at a particular given time. Sorry, I'm falling over my words. And sometimes this involves not using a linear narrative, but using a very non-linear narrative. And you can take a series of events which told in a linear narrative aren't particularly remarkable, place them in a non-linear narrative, and they can have quite a shocking effect. Sometimes if you see the effect before the cause and then learn of the cause, the effect becomes 100 times more emotionally impactful than if you see the cause and then the effect, for instance. So yeah, but I try and one of those authors whom I'm attempting to immerse my reader in the consciousness of my characters as much as I possibly can, and at the same time not interposing myself, which actually, while I'm trying to immerse them in a world and immerse them in the characters, also involves one of Elmore Leonard's like great top 10 tips for writers is don't write too much detail. You find if you describe a room very quickly to somebody, as it's done very much in old world style, there's a leather armchair in front of a roaring fire in a wood paneled room, and there's a few bookshelves on a wall. That's all the detail you got. Everybody's painting that. But if you then go on to describe the exact dimensions of the portrait above the mantelpiece, if you talk about the fact that there's a particular lalique vase sitting on it, and there's a particularly very strange form of orchid which is only found in a particular part of the Spanish Delta. And then you go across and actually there's several scratches in the wood paneling, in 4 panels in and 2 panels up, and people get bored. And I've already painted the environments in my mind, and every single time you give me a new detail on it, I've got to then factor that into the picture I've drawn, which I don't necessarily particularly want to. You wouldn't, if you were shooting a movie, have the camera move into the room and film every single area of the room before we got back to the character and they started the conversation. It would be an intensely boring movie. So if you're writing immersively and you want to keep the reader's attention, don't overburden them with detail. Give them it's back to that thing we were saying before about just exactly the right amount of detail. And again, being confident enough to know what is exactly the right amount of detail takes a little bit of practice and a little bit of learning.
You just mentioned something I 100% agree with, and it's not going into too much detail when you're writing, particularly because, one, I don't want to bog the reader down, but I actually want the reader to fill in the room with their own experiences. Or if I say there's a fireplace here and some bookshelves there, they might know a room just like that. And then I feel like that becomes more immersive for them. It sounds counterintuitive. You would think more detail would be more immersive, but I actually feel like it's the other way.
Yeah, because too much detail forces them to keep redrawing the mental picture. And that becomes hard work. And then it stops being an entertainment because they've got to keep rethinking this thing. But also, you're stopping them getting into the action because you force them to keep rethinking the environment. And therefore, you're pushing them out of the book. And you should be doing everything possible to keep them locked into the book and keep reading and keep forgetting that they're reading a book or being told a story.
We are in complete agreement. I have no idea if our styles are even remotely the same, but we are both trying to achieve the same thing.
Again, why you learn again to pull back on the very first thing that you begin to learn when you really seriously get very serious about your style is you learn to pull back on descriptors. So try and have no more than one adjective or one adverb a sentence. In fact, actually, if you can keep it down to one adverb a chapter, you're doing really, really well. Yeah, adverbs are inescapable. You can't totally banish them from your work, and your work will sound stupid if you attempt to do that. But I wince every time I read kind of sentences like slowly, lovingly, carefully. She bent down towards, and you think, nah, you didn't need any of those. She bent down towards the crib.
You know, one great piece Stephen King's book on writing had that I really took to heart when I started was, if it has an ly in the end, it can almost entirely be gotten rid of in your book. And I feel like that has helped my writing tremendously. It really has. I make my sentences better because I'm not just hanging on an ly word. Yeah,
nouns and verbs tend to be what sentences are best constructed of. And the odd adjective, you can't avoid them, but use them judiciously.
Yep.
I also believe as well, the ancient Egyptians used to believe that when you went to the afterlife, you would have to face Horus, and he would stand there with a set of scales, and he would reach into your chest and pull out your beating heart and drop it on these scales. And on the other scale, he would take a peacock's feather and he would weigh your heart against a peacock's feather. And if your heart was true and just and you were pure, then it would balance perfectly with a feather. But if you were sinful and had a horrible life, your heart would be bloated and swollen with your pride and your other sins, and it would sink. And if that was the case, you failed the first step into the afterlife, and he would pick you up bodily and throw you to a beast called Umit, which was like half crocodile and half hippopotamus. And that would tear you to shreds. And I think this is the case, except for writers. And writers, I think we will have to face Thoth, who is the god of magic and writing. I think he will weigh not our hearts, but he will weigh our text. And for every, against a feather, and for every adverb we've ever used, we'll slightly tip back. And I have to say, probably if there's too many adverbs on our scale, then we will be thrown to a many-headed critic monster that will tear us apart.
Well, I know a couple authors who are going to be in the ninth circle of hell then. So
I know a lot as well.
Before we get into the next section, I'd like to keep talking if you have a couple extra minutes here.
Absolutely.
Okay, I feel like we're scratching some good stuff here, man. You might hear my dogs go ape shit. I have thought I had timed this well, but my wife's going to be getting home from work here in maybe 10 minutes. If you start hearing barking, I'm going to mute myself and then just go into another 5-minute monologue. We'll be good to go. They'll calm down.
Don't you think it's somehow fitting when you're interviewing an author called Bark to have a cacophony? I will take it as a serenade.
Maybe instead of a monologue, you should just start woofing with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. I'm sure that would go over great. You had mentioned writing for comics before, and you'd said earlier that you have a webcomic coming out on your website. Is that right?
I've just launched it. It's at www.jasperbark.com/fearfix. And Fearfix, it's something of an homage to the black and white comics which came out in the late 60s, 70s, and early 80s. Warren Comics being the main proponent of these, but also smaller comics like the Skyward horror comics and the many different horror comics put up by Marvel. And it's also a slight homage as well to the pre-code horror comics from the 1950s, like EC and all of those wonderful comics. And like all of these comics, most of Tales, it's an anthology series. So every month there'll be there's a new story being put up. And like most anthologies, it has a very creepy, odd, bizarre, and somewhat untrustworthy host. Except in this case, the rather bizarre, creepy, strange, weird, and untrustworthy host is myself. I've turned myself into a comic character. And Rod Serling, I will be stepping in at the beginning and stepping out the end of the strip and introducing the story. And I've got I've got a backlog of work that I'm waiting to put up. I've got some of the leading artists from the independent movement, and some of the best up-and-coming artists from mainstream comics have worked with me. And I've got a lot of exciting stories I'd like to share. And the first one is up. It's called A Bad Girl's Guide to Making a Killing. And
I like that.
It involves voodoo and lots of other and serial killers and all the good things in life. Lots of murder, violence, mayhem, and please go and check it out. So if you just type in Jasper Bark Fearfix, you'll probably get it. But that code address again is www.jasperbark.com/Fearfix.
Okay.
While we're on the subjects of comics, I have a if I can just give a very egregious plug to my latest graphic novel, which is called Parassassin.
Very nice.
And this is published by Marcosia, but it's actually a collected strip, and it first appeared in the pages of Aces Weekly, which is an award-winning online comic, which is hosted. It's sort of the brainchild of David Lloyd, who was the artist on V for Vendetta, and he designed the famous anarchist Guy Fawkes mask, which is used in protests all around the world, from the Lulz hackers all the way through to the people in the Arab Spring have used this iconic image. He created it, and Aces Weekly is his latest venture. It's won a lot of awards, it's won a lot of readers, and Parassassin was originally serialized on a weekly basis over about an 8-month period. In Aces Weekly, and it's been collected with some new, never before published material by Marcosia, and it's drawn by the amazing Alpha Robbie, who is an Indonesian artist who has worked previously in a lot of manga. So it's his first European / Western work, and it's a wonderful mixture. I don't know if I can probably do it any justice at all here. It's a wonderful mixture, actually, of European American and manga styles, and it's a totally completely barking mad off the scale sci-fi time travel romp, which involves everything from political assassination to ecological politics, and it's political parody and the bleeding cutting edge of sci-fi colliding in a quite an unparalleled romp. It's received some really good acclaim already, and it's available from all good comic shops and all good online retailers.
I was just going to ask, is that available in the States?
Yep.
Or online in the States?
you can order it from your local comic shop if you wish, or you can go online and check it out on Amazon. It's Parasassin. Just type Parasassin into Amazon, or I think it's available also on Barnes and Noble and most of the good online comics retailers.
So how do you, I know you've done comics before, but how do you say get a gig writing a comic like that? Do you pitch it? Do you have your agent pitch it, assuming you have an agent? How do you begin the process of doing one of these?
It's
With the publisher like this, not your webcomic, just with the publisher.
well, I have to confess, it is a matter of networking, and comics is one of those industries. It can help if you've got an agent, but it's such a closed shop. It's such has an old boys network. That you need to make contacts within the industry. You need to get friendly with the right people. You need to be continually pitching to editors, and invariably they'll knock back your first, second, third pitches, even if they're great ideas. Don't worry about that, because just put them in a drawer and bring them out again, because once you make your first sale, it's easy to make your second and your third sale.
It's like screenwriting. Once you get one hit, you can sell your backlog.
And it is very, very similar to screenwriting. It's even a little bit harder to break into than screenwriting, in the same way that there are small independent outfits which will let you do stuff and will hardly pay you very much at all, and you'll hopefully make most of your money at the back end. There is in comics publishing independent outfits, which is where you will cut your teeth and where you will get your first breaks and where you'll get all the experience you need. And these days, a lot of the four big companies, IDW, Dark Horse, Marvel, or five, I would say, DC and Image, they will pick you up if they like what they see in the independent world. But to work for these guys, you have to keep going to conventions. You have to keep meeting with the editors. You have to strike up a correspondence. It can take years. And all the way along the way, you have to be polite. You have to be persistent. You have to be you just not have to go away, and you have to keep sending them your work and keeping up a conversation. And eventually, if they like you, and if something comes up that they think you can do, they'll give you a break and they'll give you a little go.
Now, do you have them calling you nowadays if they have something they want you to work on, or are these all ideas that you've come up with that you take to them?
It's a two-way thing, and I must confess actually that throughout the noughties, most of my income came from writing comics, mainly in Europe, with odd little gigs now and again in America, and a lot of those were a mixture of two. They'd say to you, can you pitch us some ideas? I worked on all kinds of other people's franchises, from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles through to writing DreamWorks characters, from doing Spider-Man to doing Judge Dredd and Doctor Who, other people's franchises and my own ideas. These days, I tend to focus more on the big boys in the independent field, and I tend to work with intellectual properties that I've developed with an artist. Either I've met that artist doing work for hire work, and we've gotten really, really well, and our styles gel, or artists will approach me, or I'll approach artists for particular projects, and we'll start throwing ideas backwards and forwards, and then we'll put a package together and approach a publisher. And invariably, if I approach a publisher, it's usually because I've got a good conversation started with them already, and we've built up a relationship, and they're wanting to hear ideas from me in pitches, and I'll invariably have something on the back burner, and then we'll take it and put it together and try and sell it. But Parasassin was pitched to about 4 or 5 different publishers before it was picked up by Aces Weekly, and it's one of those difficult things. It was considered for a lot of different places which were about to publish it, and then various vagaries of the market things happened, or publishers went out of business, or they cut down their things. So it came amazingly close on a few occasions. Eventually was picked up by Aces Weekly, and then because it was successful with them, was picked up by the current publishers, Marcosia.
Wow.
And I have a good relationship with Marcosia. They're the leading UK publishers, and the last couple of things I'd done for them had sold really well. So they were in a very they wanted more work from me. So they said, yeah, we'll take that. Absolutely. Which is a nice situation to be in.
So years of networking and producing great content, essentially.
Yeah. I got my first gig.
That was great because the dogs barked while I had myself muted and no one ever knew. I just said
never knew.
You didn't have to woof on camera, which I'm a little upset about, but maybe next time.
I might howl a bit later on.
Okay, that'd be great. So what about your webcomic? How do you put that together? Do you hire an artist and pay them out of pocket? Do you do some kind of, are you doing a revenue? Like, what are you doing with this?
Quite honestly, it's a purely for the fun of it. Look, I have this great story. Do you have a few minutes spare? And I'm 100% totally upfront. There is no revenue. I'm giving it away for free. I don't pretend it will be great exposure. In fact, invariably, I just say, look, this would be awful. People will hate you. Your parents will never speak to you again. Your neighbors will lob burning bricks through your window. Don't do this at any cost whatsoever at all. I think possibly the negative psychological insight makes them go, okay, I'll look at your script, Jasper. But with a lot of people these days, most of the money has gone out of comics. As I say, it used to pay my mortgage. These days, it's a much smaller part of my revenue. So the people doing it are doing it for the love of it. And there are a lot of artists out there who are getting writers to pay them to draw their dreadful scripts. And I think they're taking advantage of, people. So if an artist writes to me, I will just quite plainly point out I've spent a lot of my life doing this for professional. I'm not charging you for my script, so don't dare charge me for your work. And if you don't want to work on that basis, that's totally fine. I think you're extremely talented, but obviously this is the only way it's going to work. And a lot of them are friends, and we have fun doing stuff together. So this is just, it's like two musicians having a bit of a jam and turning on in a studio that they've got, after hours running for fun. And we're doing this between paying gigs. And here's a cool idea. And I quite like this script. And you've always wanted to draw this. So I've written this script for you. And they go, yeah, I have actually. And it will look nice in their portfolio.
Who's the artist?
Yeah.
So who is the artist?
I've got a huge number of different artists lined up. And the current artist is actually an amazing fantasy artist called Emily Hare. And this is actually her only piece of comics work she's ever done. And the script was originally written for a band called Psychotica. It was Simon Bisley who drew Slay and who's kind of like a latter-day Frazetta. And Simon Bisley's management approached me and said, can you write a script for this? It was actually to illustrate the single, it's gone out of my head, famous Black Sabbath song, Paranoid. And I actually wrote it playing on the lyrics of Paranoid and completely recontextualizing the whole story. And then Simon did some sketches, and then the group split up, and the management company paid me off and handed me back my script. And I was approached by another publisher called Murky Depths, who wanted to do it. So I wrote it, and we went through a couple of artists, and Emily came aboard to do it. And then we discovered at the very, very last minute that we no longer had the rights to use the lyrics for Paranoid. So I had to actually have some brilliant visuals drawn by Emily, but I had to rewrite every single piece of the story and make it a totally different story. So I started again from scratch. I started with a bunch of lyrics, turned it into a story, which then I couldn't use. And then so I then had a whole set of visuals, which looked great. And I had to completely rewrite the entire story, everything about it all. And then Murky Depths went out of business. So
it's such a great business.
You know what? It is this business. It's very much this case. I thought, you know what? I'll publish it. I have got lots of really, really great artists. Unfortunately, for all kinds of reasons, I can't announce them just yet, but please watch this space.
Well, I want to ask too, just not to get into the weeds of the business model too much, although honestly, the people who listen are probably about 50% writers, want to be writers, working on being writers, whatever you want to call them, and 50% readers. So how are you trying to do any kind of conversion from this? Newsletter signups, just focusing on web traffic to maybe funnel stuff to your books or your other comics?
It's a profile raising exercise. I will eventually, because I have enough of a body of work already stockpiled, I will eventually collect it all together with some original material into a graphic novel, which you will be an actual, which you'll be able to buy off both online from places like Comixology and through a publisher. I have enough publishers soliciting work from me that I know I would click this and actually eventually sell it. And then there will be a revenue split from this with myself and all the artists actually involved, which will end up being a nice little gift at the end. It'll be $50-$60 for everyone involved in the project, because that's kind of roughly the amount of revenue that should come from it. For my own self and own personal basis, obviously it drives traffic to my website. And while they're up on my website, of course, the key thing then is to buy them into your product. And we're working in an economy at the moment where we've moved from the typical capitalist model, which is you offer goods and or services for wages and or a specific given fee, which used to be the way the industry worked. And nowadays we're moving on something that's kind of half the old capitalist, what you would call a barter economy. I offer you this, you give me this in return. And these days we're half that, and we're half a gift economy. And a gift economy works on the basis that everybody offers what their particular given skill or set of goods that they produce to the community for free. And as long as enough people offer enough of the right kind of goods, we all put it into the same pot. We all take what out of the same pot, and everybody's looked after. And some more people have described them as primitive societies, and sometimes some quite complex, archaic societies have worked on a gift basis. Everybody gives something for free, and everybody takes something for free. These are more difficult in a larger global economy, but increasingly, a creative career involves like a halfway house, some element of a gift economy and some element of a barter economy. And you have to give stuff away for free. I worked for 15 years as a national journalist, mainly writing about film and music, but writing about a variety of other things as well. I made an extremely good living at that. These days, I write about half what I wrote as a journalist, but I still write an inordinate amount of journalism. But I give most of it away for free. I'm out the writing. I'm doing guest editorials or guest blogs on other people's blogs in order to raise my profile. I'm blogging myself for free and giving it away for free. And the idea is I plug the products that I'm selling, or I draw people to my website and they get used to my brand, and everything on my website is geared towards steering towards the products I am selling. But at the same time, a lot of what I'm writing is given away for free to the cosmos with a completely open heart. Please enjoy this. And if people only ever read that, well, that's fine. But after a while, they begin to like you, and you will convert 40 to 30% of the people who take your free stuff into buying customers. And of that 40 to 30%, 50% of them, you'll then convert into what Stephen King would call a constant reader. They'll buy everything you write.
You're converting 30 to 40%? What? Holy shit.
Well, people who
I convert like 6 from my good stuff.
Well, yeah, roughly that.
So you give away the webcomic. Do you give away any books as well? Like on Amazon, do you have any freebies or anything like that?
Interestingly, I am just about to give away one book. It's a horrible piece of fiction called Stuck on You, which has been available purely as an ebook, and it's part of an anthology called Stuck on You and Other Prime Cuts. But this is a novella, and I'm about to convert that into completely for free, and that contains a series of links as well in the back to get people on my mailing list. Mailing lists are very, very key because they every other avenue of communication that you have, it's difficult to communicate directly with the people who are reading your work. So mailing lists are a way of getting directly to the people, bearing in mind that, again, 50% of the people who sign up for your mailing list sign up for the free stuff and then never read your stuff, and 50% will read your
Only 50%, like 70% of mine never opened my email, my first email.
Well, there is that, isn't there?
But it works. I mean, if you deal with volume.
Yeah, and so you put it.
30%
This
huge.
is what it is. You're trying to get as many eyes as possible on your work, and you give stuff away for free. And
I call it the drug dealer approach. So I'm giving away free samples because I'm hoping I can hook you. I give away whole novels for free on Amazon and iTunes. That if I have a 2-3 book series, I'll give away the first novel for free, because if I can give away 100,000 copies, even if I'm only getting, 6% conversion on those free books across my series, I'm doing pretty well for myself. I'm paying, my mortgage for the year just on that. So
it's a numbers game.
It can work. Yeah.
This is how it works. As I say, so it is. We're partly in a gift economy and we're partly in a barter economy, and it's a new way of doing business. And it's not a business model that existed, I think, 10 years ago. Certainly didn't exist kind of like 15, 20 years ago when I first came into the industry. If I was
digital delivery has definitely changed all this. My cost for giving those books away is zero, whereas 15 years ago, if I'm giving away 100,000 free books, I'm bankrupt.
And the cost you've had is, of course, the fact that you've spent 3 to 6 months writing the novel, and that was time that eventually will need to be reimbursed. But you add that as a collateral, as a kind of a loss leader against the eventual revenue you get from your other work.
It's advertising. I'm not buying ads on the television now. I'm giving away free books. It's still a cost, but yeah.
And it works because you've picked up free books, haven't you?
Well, that's the other thing I like about this approach, is that I'm allowing someone to try my stuff for free. I don't want them to feel cheated. And then if they like my work, they can continue on for a couple bucks. They can buy the rest of the series. And if they don't like it, they just stop reading it. No harm, no foul. And they move on. Now, I have found my reviews, the average rating went down a little bit as I went free, particularly on one of my books. But for the most part, it doesn't go down that much. I think a lot of people, if they get something for free, a lot of people won't bitch about it. They'll just move on. It wasn't my thing, whatever. Like they maybe wouldn't have bought it in the first place if it was $5, but because it was free, they got it.
Yeah.
So a lot of those people just won't review it because they understand it wasn't their thing. Now, some people will.
It's interesting, isn't it? There are the advocates, and there are the hobby horses, and then there are the bizarre people who just want to sound off about stuff. It's the people who say, I got this book, and the last page of it was completely missing, and it was all garbled up. 1 star. Apart from that.
Oh, yeah. I get that all the time. Book didn't download to my Kindle, 1 star. I'm like, dude, I did. Contact Amazon, man. Yeah, well, that happens.
About that. But that wasn't my fault. Don't penalize me. Yeah. But you get the people who say, the mailman shoved it to my letterbox and tore the cover. 1 star.
My dog ate the book. Bullshit. 1 star.
Yeah. Well, and that brings down your aggregate score ever so slightly. So you're kind of going from that 4.8 to like 4.72.
Now, I will say one thing: if you go free and if you manage to have a book that takes off, like I had one of my free books. I don't even know how much I've given. It's enormous.
That's fantastic.
The problem is once you start breaking 1,000 reviews, 2,000 reviews, the amount of negative reviews, even if 5% are 1 stars, you're dealing with an enormous amount of reviews. So I feel like most authors are going to have to temper the way they read the reviews. If you're reading 50 reviews of a book, maybe there's 1 5-star, 3 5 stars. That might not be enough to bring down your mood. If you're reading 75 1 stars on your book, that can be soul crushing.
And you have to be in the right frame of mind to accept that. And again, this is another fascinating thing because I did start publishing comics and novels in the pre-internet days, when you would get 1 or 2 reviews in fanzines, and you get more than that. You get about 10 or 12 reviews in fanzines, and you get 3 or 4 reviews in actual magazines which covered your field. And sometimes, if you're extremely lucky, someone in the national press would give you a tiny little kind of paragraph, and that will be all the feedback you get over like a 6-month period. Be 12 reviews tops. The volume of feedback you get on your work these days is huge,
and fast too.
You would get 1 or 2 letters occasionally, whereas now you get a message every other day on social media across a variety of platforms from people who've read your work And sometimes one said the bizarrest thing about it. Why did you put that comma in the middle of that clause on page 43, paragraph 2? Did you really need to do that? And you'd be going, what?
One thing about writing in the horror genre is I get some weird emails from people. I'm like, I don't know if you missed your medication tonight, but I didn't quite follow that. I got one. I don't even remember what it was, but it's one of my favorites. I actually printed it. Your book is good, but not as good as Stephen King. That was the whole email. Like, why did you track me down to tell me this? It wasn't a review. It was just an email.
I've read every single one of your books and I hate them all. When is your next one coming out?
Right.
Like,
you suck.
Do you want to buy it? Yes, I've been the first person to buy it, but I hate everything you do. And you'll be thinking, well, do I engage? How do I engage with this conversation? Please keep buying my books. I'm sorry you hate them all.
I thank everyone, no matter what they say. Hey, you bought it. I appreciate that.
That's the key thing. You paid money. Thank you so much. You contributed in a small way to my electricity bill, and I love you for it.
This whiskey's on you, my friend.
Yes.
So we're starting to extend out here a little bit. I appreciate you staying on. I felt like we were. I don't get to talk actual writing structure sometimes with people because I find a lot of writers, like even when we were talking about looking at the page and the way it looks on the page, I feel like is important, but I don't think a lot of writers actually think about that. They're thinking more about their prose, maybe not the look of their prose as someone's reading it, if that makes sense. So I appreciated that.
Yeah, yes, things like this, the way it looks on the page, is so important.
Yeah, the aesthetic is so huge, and I don't feel like a lot of people think about it.
It's similar to when you have fine dining, and you go stop at like a nice kind of like diner or a nice kind of like roadside dive. You expect the plates to be kind of like piled up and kind of heaving and just smell good. You go to a fine dining restaurant, they've thought about every single element, how it smells, how the waiter will put it down in front of you, how every single piece of the meal is arranged on the plate. And it is the same with writing. You know, the people, everybody picks up a book who's a bibliophile and goes, oh, love the smell of the book, the smell of the print, the smell of the paper, the smell even of the binding on the book, and the way the specific font that the layout artist has used on your work. And again, whether it's like it's a small chapter with a few paragraphs, all these things are key to your reader's appreciation of the work. And while I don't get I do get anal about the layout, and if the layout artists will give me options, I will engage an ongoing conversation with them. I wish I didn't, because I probably have other things that are far more important to take up my time as a writer, but I will, because these things are so important. And I will think about, it's paragraph structures, paragraph size, arrangement on the page. All these things are key, absolutely key, to the reader's appreciation, because I notice them as I read things myself. I'm not just an author, I'm an ardent and avid reader. So I know what I like.
Do you get your newest book that it just came out, right? We've been trying to have this conversation for 2 months, so I'm assuming it came out sometime in this 2 months.
It did.
Was that through Crystal Lake?
That's right.
Now, does he give you input on certain things like that, or do you turn it in and let him work his magic?
Do you know what? Fascinatingly enough, Crystal Lake have become, over a very short period of time, one of the leading indie publishers. And Joe has gone from it being something he did for a little bit of fun as a secondary career to it being his life, and being able to employ a little kind of like international staff and crew. So he's paying other people's bills and mortgages as well as his own from just doing this, because he's so good about it all. And he attracts such incredible talent because they consult you at every single level. And as an author, you have, if you want it, and a tremendous control in how your work is taken. And I've worked for big mainstream publishers, and they've never consulted me to this degree. But also, they've never employed so many editors, proofreaders, and sub-editors. And I'll get 4 or 5 different proofs of my work coming through after I've read it for my input. Different proofreaders will pick up different things, and they'll, ongoing little things, and so many eyes on a text, getting it to, and obviously you're not at that stage whereby you're not frightened by the editing process. I'm presuming it's something that you'll get excited about because it's improving your work. I've written 4 or 5 drafts before I hand it over to an editor, and I'm actually looking forward to them picking out all the kind of weaknesses so I can then improve it again. It's not an attack, it's not an affront, they're not misunderstanding my work, they've got my back, and they're seriously improving what I do.
It's not a giant conglomerate just working on the churn.
And isn't that great?
Trying to make your book better.
Yeah, because my name's on the book, but there's been a team of people making certain this text is good. So I always make a point of actually saying thank you for those people and their input on that work. And there have been occasions when I've suffered at the hand of not most professional proofreaders. It's been occasions. There's one book of mine, which I won't name, came out with a very big publisher, and I don't know how many proofreaders they had in it, but the last person put in a whole bunch of mistakes. People mention it in the reviews that there's all sorts of typos in the text. And I actually have gone through the text and gone back to the last manuscript that I agreed with the editor. And those mistakes are in there. They were put in there.
They uploaded an old version.
And it makes you weep. It makes you weep to think that somebody else was paid to put mistakes into my work. And so many really...
Your work with your name on it. Nobody knows who the editor is in the novel.
No. And the editor didn't even do it. It was done somewhere down the line by a proofreader or and that person got paid money to put mistakes in. And so many proofreaders and so many editors have improved my work. Just fortunately occasionally. So that the care and the concern that Crystal Lake actually take with the text at every single level, from consulting you about the cover to the back cover blurb, which is something that some publishers don't do, and all the way through to...
I could rant about covers and blurbs and descriptions from publishers forever. It's mind-boggling, some of these covers.
Yeah. And I worked as a copywriter as well, and one of my earliest jobs as a copywriter was for publishers. So I wrote back cover blurb. So I have an idea about the craft. So yes, sometimes they don't always do the best job. But if you've been in this industry long enough, you've been burned. And publishing is unfortunately like that. And every author has an endless row of horror stories that we all reel out at conventions after several whiskies.
Is this your second book through them?
No, interestingly, it's my fourth.
Fourth?
Fourth, yes. That's my fourth book with them. And I've even signed a contract to bring out another book with them. So that's a sign of the great working relationship and what a great outfit they are to work with at every level, actually. So hugely recommend them. And the other thing is I'm actually a fan of a lot of the work that they put out. Certain publishers, like certain kind of record labels, you're prepared to take a chance on an artist or an author you don't know, because it's got this it's brought up by this imprint, it's brought up by that publisher. The Del Abyss lines back in the early 90s was an example of an imprint where you just think everything put out by this publisher is pure quality. I'll just buy it. I don't know who this author is, and invariably they were sometimes first-time authors, but you just knew it was going to be of certain quality. Everybody has certain labels, and at certain points, whatever genre of music you're into, there's certain labels will just bring out absolute key stuff, whether it be Sub Pop or Ninja Tunes or any other of any labels, Chemical Records, various different times. You just know you'll buy everything from that label. Crystal Lake are one of those publishers. They publish me, but actually they publish a lot of my favorite books of the year of the past 4 years. And I've been introduced to a lot of amazing authors that they published. They've published people of the caliber of Clive Barker and now Stephen King, and Jack Ketchum and Edward Lee, a lot of absolute legends. And they've encouraged some amazing first-time authors as well. So they've maintained a really high quality throughout, and it's a real pleasure to work with them.
Wow. I didn't know you had 4.
I only just counted up my mind myself and thought, gosh, 4. And I've agreed to do a 5th with them. There you go.
Wow, that's fantastic. What's the name of the book that just came out?
It's called Quiet Places.
A little different than Para Assassin.
Yes, and interestingly, I am known for writing work that tends to, in that awful phrase, that does tend to go there. It is very, some of my writing is extremely visceral. I do not shy away from graphic sex or violence. And I actually like the idea of writing work that is of a high, to use that awful term, literary caliber, but at the same time has the same sensational elements as a pulp novel. This actually contains no sex, not even so much as a peck on the cheek, and no physical violence, not even so much as a paper cut.
Hence quiet in the title.
Yes, although I don't think it is a piece of quiet horror. And I do think it is probably one of the single most disturbing things I've ever written. And it has been racking up a tremendous amount of 5-star reviews. So fingers crossed that maintains and carries on.
Quiet Places. This is available, I'm assuming, everywhere. Amazon, iTunes, Barnes & Noble.
Yep. At the moment, it's principally available from Amazon.com. Although you, obviously it is still available through bookshops. You can get an actual physical quality. You can certainly order it from your bookshop, but Amazon is your best first stop, one stop. And for a whole variety of reasons, Amazon has an exclusive limited sales period on it for all kinds of reasons of publishing, which I have nothing to do with.
Okay, so it's available under Kindle Unlimited, I'm assuming, then?
Kindle Unlimited.
Okay.
It's available. I don't think it's yet out as a Nook or the rest of it, but it will be in a few months' time. And it's available also in the hard copy, which I'm holding.
Do you know if Crystal Lake is doing a lot of Kindle exclusive right now, or are they all over the map with that?
I'm not certain, actually. That's an area of their business development I don't know about.
I'm just curious, like maybe of your back catalog. Do you know, are those books available everywhere, or are they still exclusive to Amazon?
Everything else in my back catalog is now available right across the board on every e-reader platform and through every distribution level as a hard copy. Originally speaking, I believe there are all sorts of incentives that Amazon offers publishers, particularly smaller publishers, to go exclusive with them for a particularly given period.
Typically for the first 3 months, yeah. That's why I was curious if they're doing maybe their launches on Amazon, because that's a better launch strategy for them, and then going wide later. That's what a lot of indies do as well. So honestly, that's the sign that they're paying attention to the times. They're rolling with the punches. That's why I was curious if your back catalog was everywhere or not. So interesting.
Back catalog is everywhere. This at the moment is available exclusive through Amazon, although I believe you can order it through most bookshops. My local tiny bookshop in my little tiny rural town carries a copy, somewhat grudgingly, I think, but it still carries a copy.
Quiet Places, a novel of cosmic folk horror. I think you've sold me there, man.
Yes, folk horror is one of those wonderful genres, and it sort of starts with movies like The Wicker Man or Blood on Satan's Claw. It arose out of the 1970s, which was a time of great social, political, and financial unrest, where people were weirdly very, very uncertain. And there was a lot of economic uncertainty in people's lives, and there seemed to be a lot of polarization in society, and there was a lot of us and thems, and particularly it tends to focus on the constellation that comes, the mistrust that comes between rural settings and urban settings. And also the 1970s was a time when everybody was leaving the cities and the urban conurbations because they were too dangerous, and moving out to the wonderful homesteads and rediscovering the joys of getting back to nature. And there's fabulous novels like Thomas Tryon's Harvest Home, which is a fabulous example of folk horror, which kind of shows that maybe the people in these rural areas, which were being invaded by all these latter-day yuppies from the big city, weren't probably too pleased about this sudden influx of new urban knights, and it's about the and also it reconnects with a lot of ancient atavistic primal forces which exist in the countryside, and it's a great way of exploring all that folklore that we've banished, and all the superstitious beliefs and the forces which perhaps seem somewhat foolish under the kind of harsh glare of a sodium streetlight, but along a rutted country lane with only the stars or the moon shows, perhaps suddenly have a reawoken kind of fear about them. So this is very much in that kind of genre, updated for a 21st century audience. And of course, it also has a very, very strong cosmic. I'm very into both those two genres, both folk horror and cosmic horror. And I have blended the two in a way I think that is quite unique to this particular novel and to myself.
Is it a novel or a novella?
It's a novella. It's a short novel, long novella.
Okay. I was just curious because I saw a novella in the title and I wanted to see. I love novellas for horror in particular. I feel like it makes authors be concise sometimes.
It's interesting how I'm reading an amazing collection called The Dark Descent, which came out in the 1980s. Was anthologized by David G. Hartwell, who is an amazing anthologist. And he actually went through, it came out in the 1980s when it was the rise of the horror novel. And he'd been pointing out the fact that up until about the late 1970s, early 1980s, when you get Ira Levin bringing out Rosemary's Baby and then Stepford Wives, and you get Thomas Tryon and novels, and of course, Stephen King arrives and really blows the medium up. Up until that point, horror hadn't really been a genre that translated well to a novel. It was very difficult to keep that suspense going throughout the whole thing, and it worked better in short little doses. And in fact, even horror movies tend to translate better from either long short stories or novellas, because they're about the perfect kind of novel length. And so I think up until that point, all the really great horror fiction had been short stories, and in many, many ways, at many different times, genre fiction had kept the short story alive, and that was never more obvious than in the ghost story or the horror story. So Dark Descent is a fabulous anthology, and it sort of goes all the way from people like Sheridan Le Fanu through some really great literary work, people like M.R. James and, of course, Henry James, all the way through to what was then quite modern contemporary authors like Dennis Etchison, Clive Barker, and, of course, King. Strongly recommend that. But to get back to the point about that, the novella is almost a perfect length because it allows you to be a little bit more complex, to explore deeper psychological depths to your character, to create much more complex and interesting atmospheres, to explore backstories which can feed into a character's thing. But at the same time, you don't have to pad something out. You don't have to go over 400 pages. You can keep ramping up the suspense and build to a real absolute climax. So I often find novellas are a great, perfect length sometimes for a real, if you want a real high impact ending where your entire story is moving towards something that's going to hopefully terrify the reader and blow their mind, novella is a perfect length for that. I have to say it is one of the single most disturbing, horrific things I've ever done to a character, and the ending is really quite horrible. And as I say, there is no blood, no guts, no gore, no chainsaws, no ball gags.
All right, I'm gonna have to get it. The hell with it. I'll buy it when we get done here. You sold me. You know what? We've gone really long here.
We have, haven't we? Good Lord.
Yes, we need to wrap this up, but I would love to do this again soon. I have an idea for something we can talk about. I'll pitch it to you when we're done here. But where can people find you? I'm sorry.
JasperBark.com. I've got a Facebook page, which is just, if you just type Jasper Bark into Facebook. I'm at Jasper Bark on Twitter. I am on Instagram, but I rarely post there. I'm even on LinkedIn. If you just type Jasper Bark into any of those things. Yeah, I have a Patreon page, which I'm doing nothing with really at the moment. So if you just want to throw some money my way, that'd be cool. And type Jasper Bark into YouTube. I have a YouTube channel, which I have some big things planned for.
Excellent. All right, Jasper, thanks so much, man.
Thank you.